You need to sit still for this one. You genuinely need to lock the phone down, kill the second screen, and sit with what I am about to walk you through, because what Kendrick Lamar did to Drake's fan base is no longer a rap conversation. It stopped being a rap conversation the second the Super Bowl 59 confetti hit the field. What is unfolding right now in 2026, more than 2 years after that final diss record slammed onto streaming, is a fully documented psychological event scholars will be picking apart for the next 20 years. And I am telling you, on this channel, this needs to be studied, not gossiped about. Studied. Because the man who dropped Not Like Us in the spring of 2024 has somehow, in the summer of 2026, produced a fan base on the other side of that verdict that is still crashing out in public, in real time, over songs that arrived when Joe Biden was still sitting behind the Resolute desk. There are grown men in Toronto right this second, in Kendrick Lamar's alleged enemy territory, who are launching Bluetooth speakers across public patios, filming half-baked apology videos, and starting GoFundMe pages to replace equipment they smashed because somebody near them dared to play the wrong Kendrick Lamar track. That is not fandom or loyalty. That is a documented behavioral pattern the culture has never witnessed before. Drop a like right now if you have seen this happen with your own 2 eyes. Tap that subscribe button and drop a comment before we go any deeper, because I am about to walk you through why the exact architecture Kendrick Lamar built, the songs, the timing, the industry positioning, and the one line I am promising you we will reach before this video ends, is the precise reason the losing side is still bleeding out in the summer of 2026. Everybody keeps asking who won the battle. That is the wrong question. The right question, and the only question that matters at this point, is why the losing side is somehow losing harder right now than they were losing on the day Not Like Us actually dropped. And what that fact reveals about the machinery humming underneath all of this that nobody in mainstream hip-hop media wants to say out loud. Let me set the table properly for the newcomers, because if you are new to the channel, or if you have been buried under a rock for the last 24 months, you need the full picture before we drift any further into the deep water. In the spring of 2024, Kendrick Lamar and Drake, Aubrey Drake Graham for the government paperwork, the biggest commercial rapper of the last decade and a half, entered the most publicly consumed rap battle in the recorded history of the genre. Not one of the biggest, streams-wise, footprint-wise, culturally. Not Like Us alone became the most streamed diss record ever measured, hoovered up multiple Grammy statues, including Record of the Year and Song of the Year at the 67th Grammy Awards, and then anchored the Super Bowl 59 halftime slot in February 2025, which itself became the most watched halftime performance in television history. He did not simply win the battle. He converted the battle into a permanent piece of infrastructure lodged inside American pop culture. Meanwhile, Drake spent the back half because what has actually kept happening long after the last diss stopped dropping, long after he walked into the GNX era, long after Drake walked into whatever era his current rollout has christened, is that Drake's fan base did not walk with him. Drake's fan base got frozen. Drake's fan base has calcified inside the emotional weather of May 2024. And the stakes of that freeze are not merely personal. They are not merely cultural. They are systemic. Personally, this means Drake is walking into the back half of the decade dragging a stan army that is active, a Drake fan in Toronto, in Drake's own home city, in the city Drake calls the Six, in the city Drake has spent over a decade constructing an entire cinematic identity around defending, physically assaulted another person's Bluetooth speaker because that person was playing a Kendrick Lamar record in a public park. Just playing it. Not pointing it at him. Not shouting it in his direction. Just playing music. And this grown adult, in a place with witnesses and cameras, decided the correct response was to grab the speaker and hurl it across the concrete. And then, because this is 2026 and the front-facing camera is genuinely one of the worst inventions in modern civilization, he came back and filmed an apology video that was not actually an apology video, in which he explained he did what he did because he did not want, and I am paraphrasing closely, Canadians to look like clowns in front of the Americans. He then launched a GoFundMe, to replace the property he had personally destroyed. So the fans have to underwrite his emotional collapse. Say that back to yourself and tell me whether that is a healthy fandom or a documented distress signal wearing a jersey. The second piece of surface evidence is the Rogers Centre run. He and SZA rolled through Toronto in the summer of 2025 on the Grand National Tour, sold out 2 nights inside the Rogers Centre in the middle of Drake's own city, and received a full standing ovation during Not Like Us. A standing ovation in Toronto for the song about Drake. And Drake, per every reputable outlet that covered the run, did not attend, did not respond publicly, and instead spent that stretch running a live stream marathon with Kai Cenat. That is the visible, camera-caught moment where you watch the emotional geography of an entire culture redraw itself in real time in front of a stadium of witnesses. The third piece of surface evidence is the streaming data, and this is the terrain where the loyalist camp really loves to shell game the story. Yes, Drake still puts up massive daily streaming numbers. Nobody serious has ever argued Drake stopped being a commercial force. But when you look at the composition of those streams, and you set them against how Kendrick Lamar's catalog has been consumed since the record landed, the picture you get is nothing like the picture the Stan Army is trying to sell. His post-beef streams are being consumed as event records, as cultural monuments, as sit-down-and-study material. Drake's streams are being consumed as background music inside gyms, inside restaurants, inside cars on the way to somewhere else. Those two consumption profiles are not equivalent. Those numbers do not carry the same cultural mass. Anybody inside this industry knows the difference between a stream that means something and a stream that is just the algorithm doing its default job. The fourth piece of surface evidence, and this one bruises if you are being honest, is the state of Drake's own public communications right now. This is a man who used to control every narrative he was inside. This is a man who used to time his posts, leaks, features, and alliances with the discipline of a grandmaster. And now, in 2026, Drake is watching his fanbase speak for him in public in ways he cannot correct, cannot moderate, and cannot walk back. And the version of Drake the world sees is being drawn, one frame at a time, by people who cannot safely hold a portable speaker. Does everybody understand how catastrophic that is for a brand? Does everybody grasp what it means when the loudest voices representing you in the wild are the exact same voices making your case impossible to defend? Sugar, if the whispers hold any weight. We are only getting started, because this next section is the one the loyalist camp is truly going to hate. Lock in with me here, because what I am about to unpack is not surface noise. This is the layer where the people who actually know these artists have been quietly speaking, and where the culture around Drake began showing hairline fractures even the fan base cannot spin its way around. Do not save your comments for the end. Drop one right now. Tell me who you believe this fan base is genuinely loyal to, because the deeper we dig, the less the answer looks like the man on the album covers. Layer 2, the cultural layer, is where the whole situation slides from embarrassing to genuinely revealing, because you have to remember something crucial about how a rap beef actually ages. When a beef ends, the artists themselves usually walk away faster than anybody. What stays behind is the orbit around those artists. The associates, the affiliates, the producers with unfinished credits, the podcasters with unfinished takes, the fellow rappers inside this industry. When the phone stops ringing and the cosigns stop landing on schedule, that is the culture telling you something that will never make it into a press release. The second piece of cultural evidence is what happened inside Drake's own city during the Rogers Center run. Reports out of Toronto during that stretch documented heightened security around his team on the ground, and that certain Toronto-affiliated figures inside Drake's broader orbit, including Top 5, a Toronto rapper broadly understood as Drake-adjacent, posted videos that read to any reasonable reader as direct threats, and, per widely circulated reports, was allegedly seen circling his hotel in downtown Toronto. That is a member of, and once you hear it, you cannot unhear it. The fourth piece of cultural evidence, and this one gets closest to the heart of the whole story, is the fan base's own narrative labor. What you are watching in real time is Drake's most invested fans performing what behavioral scientists would call motivated reasoning at an industrial scale. They are inventing entire alternative histories of the beef, insisting Kendrick Lamar took, and I am quoting directly from the commentary circulating in that ecosystem, the sucker way out. As if a rap battle where you drop the biggest single of the decade could ever be filed under sucker behavior. They are arguing that Kendrick othered Drake by pointing out he is from Canada, and then in the same conversation, these same commentators are calling the fans of the World Cup Black Canadians without registering the internal collision. Because inside that headspace, the collision is invisible. Because underneath everything we have just walked through, there is a business layer, an industry layer, a machinery layer, and if you do not understand that layer, you do not actually understand the story. Everything I have described so far is symptomatology. What I am about to walk you through is the underlying condition, and I want to unpack it across three interlocked angles, because all three empty into the same conclusion. Angle 1. The label positioning. Kendrick Lamar and they are shaped by algorithmic placement, editorial playlist decisions, cross-catalog recommendation weighting, and label-driven push campaigns. When you are in good standing with your label, and the label's distribution partners are actively pushing your catalog, you receive placement you never had to request. When you are locked in litigation against that label, that placement quietly, slowly, invisibly shifts. Nobody announces it. Nobody sends out a memo saying we are deprioritizing Artist X's back catalog. It simply happens, one editorial choice at a time. And when you look at what has been happening to catalog-level Drake streams against event-level Kendrick Lamar streams over the past 18 months, you can see the shape of that migration if you know what you are looking at. This is exactly what people miss when they wave the daily stream count in your face. Of course, Drake still outputs bigger raw numbers on some days. Drake has a bigger catalog. Drake has been dropping records twice a year for over a decade. Raw volume is not the metric. Placement quality is the metric. Editorial trust is the metric. And on those metrics, the picture is not the picture the fan base is being sold. Angle 3, and this is the deepest of the three, so stay locked in with me on this one. The narrative infrastructure. What he understood, and what nobody in the surrounding conversation seems to fully grasp, is that a rap beef in 2024 is not fought inside the songs. The songs are the surface layer. The real war is fought inside the narrative infrastructure surrounding the songs. The podcasts, the reaction channels, the memes, the TikToks, the reels, the think pieces, the academic essays, the fan communities, the algorithm's memory of what people are searching for 6 months later, a year later, 2 years later. He did not merely make better records. He engineered records that were structurally built to embed themselves inside that narrative infrastructure in a way that would keep replaying and resurfacing and relitigating themselves without him ever having to lift another finger. Not Like Us is not a song. Not Like Us is a public event that keeps executing on schedule. Not Like Us is a piece of content that operates independently of its creator's ongoing effort. That is why, 2 years later, it is still doing damage. That is why, 2 years later, Drake fans are still hurling speakers over it. Because his record was not engineered to win a battle. It was engineered to become part of the operating system of hip-hop conversation. And once a record enters the operating system, it does not need its author anymore. It runs on its own. That is what I am saying, and what the evidence of 2 full years now supports, is that he understood something about Drake's specific fan base that Drake himself either did not understand or refused to accept. That Drake's fan base was structurally built on parasocial identification. It was built on the underlying idea that Drake is one of them. That Drake speaks for them. That when Drake wins, they win. And when Drake is attacked, they are attacked. That is not a normal fan base structure. Most fan bases love the music and respect the artist as a separate entity. Drake's fan base, it is a description of what the culture is going to have to reckon with, because we have never seen a rap record function this way before, and we will never look at rap beefs the same way again. Call this what it actually is. Call this post-verdict denial syndrome. Call this the May 15th freeze, because that is what you are watching. A fan base whose internal calendar froze on the day he delivered the ruling, and no amount of Iceman-branded rollouts, no amount of academics monologues, no amount of GoFundMe fundraising is going to unfreeze that calendar. Now let me give the loyalist camp one honest concession, because I am not on this microphone to pretend everything Drake has produced during this stretch has been a disaster. Every additional year Drake spends declining to stand on the second step is another year the culture spends remembering exactly why the first step was already claimed. And here is where the machinery gets genuinely ugly, because I want to be specific about the people carrying water for Drake right now inside the media ecosystem. I want to name the pattern out loud. Not just academics, though academics is the concierge of the collapse, running the same recycled rumor cycle every 90 days about Kendrick being cornered, panicked, scared, working on a diss album, running out of runway. Fill in whichever verb is convenient this particular Tuesday. But it is not just academics. It is the entire second tier of hip-hop commentary that has quietly outsourced its opinion to whichever direction the loudest streaming numbers happen to be pointing. It is the reply guy content farm apparatus that has turned every Drake talking point into a coordinated Monday morning deployment. It is the podcasters who used to have taste and now have angles. It is the timeline janitors. He is doing what Kendrick has done from day one, which is releasing exceptional records on his own schedule, performing on the largest stages on earth when it is time, and letting the work do the arguing on its own behalf. That is the discipline that made this entire outcome possible. That is the discipline that turned Not Like Us into the piece of infrastructure it became. And that is the discipline that is going to keep him standing exactly where he is standing, at the top of this culture, for as long as he chooses to remain there. Because inside a media environment where every artist is expected to be online, be reactive, be constantly generating content about their own daily existence, the artist who refuses to participate in that expectation ends up looking like the only adult in the room. Every silence he keeps makes every noise the Drake camp produces sound louder, tinnier, more desperate by comparison. That is not luck. That is not accident. That is doctrine. That is a system. That is a mode of operating inside modern celebrity that he appears to be the only mainstream hip-hop figure who has fully internalized. The contrast one-liner writes itself. One artist made a record that ended a conversation. The other artist filed a lawsuit trying to unmake the record. And 2 years later, Kendrick Lamar's record is still playing inside every stadium on the continent, and Drake's lawsuit is still sitting inside appeals. That is the entire story in a single sentence, if you want it packaged for the group chat. When you walk back through every moment we have just covered, the Toronto crash out, the Rogers Center standing ovation, the podcast circuit's polite distance, the fan base's motivated reasoning, the label litigation, the streaming shift, the narrative infrastructure, every one of those moments empties into the same conclusion. The person who operated with discipline is the person still standing. The person who operated from reactivity is the person whose fan base has become the ongoing story instead of the artist. That is not luck. That is not cosmic favor. The most damaging to the Drake brand itself. Because I have my own answer already logged, and I have my own ranking, and I am curious whether the audience clocks the exact same one I clocked. And while you are down there, tell me whether you think Kendrick's continued silence is intentional strategy or simple personal preference, because those are two very different diagnoses that lead to two very different long-range forecasts for where this culture is heading next. Before we close this thing out, let me put one last receipt on the table, because I already know somebody in the comment section is going to try to argue this, and I want to head it off at the door. Somebody is going to say, look, Drake still sells out arenas. Drake still moves units. Drake is fine. And the response to that is not to pretend Drake is not commercially viable. Of course Drake is commercially viable. Drake has been commercially viable since 2009. The question is not whether Drake can still sell tickets. The question is whether Drake, the real story is that Kendrick built a piece of cultural infrastructure that has kept running every single day since, with zero maintenance required from its architect, inflicting damage that compounds instead of dissipating. The real story is that Drake, rather than accepting that outcome and pivoting toward the future, chose to sue his own machine, and in doing so, permanently altered his own relationship with the very apparatus that used to elevate him for free. The real story is that Drake's fan base, rather than processing the verdict and moving on, chose to freeze in place and become the ongoing punchline of the whole event. And the real story is that Kendrick, through the deployment of a discipline the culture is still trying to reverse engineer, has managed to remain the loudest voice in the room without ever raising his voice above a conversational register. That is the whole thing. That is what everybody keeps. And if you thought what we just walked through was damaging, the receipts are already printed. And every 90 days from here, the receipts get harder to argue with. See you inside the next one, for real this time.